A luxurious mansion in Beverly Hills, where crystal chandeliers cast shadows on marble floors, and the scent of old money lingers in the air. That's where I first met them, the unlikely couple that would become the talk of high society. She was 65, a self-made real estate mogul worth millions, while he was just 28, with nothing but charm and ambitious dreams in his pocket. Their romance seemed like a fairy tale. At least that's what everyone wanted to believe. He swept her off her feet at a charity gala, all bright smiles and smooth compliments. Within 6 months, they were married in an extravagant ceremony that made headlines across town. But beneath the surface of their picture-perfect relationship, something darker was brewing. I watched as he gradually worked his way into every aspect of her life, becoming her confidant, her advisor, and eventually a signatory on her accounts. The signs were there, but love has a way of blinding even the sharpest minds. She showered him with gifts, a Ferrari, a diamond-studded Rolex, and even made him the director of her newest property development project. But Mrs. Richardson wasn't the fool everyone thought she was. Behind those designer glasses and perfectly styled silver hair was a woman who hadn't built her empire by being naive. She'd noticed the late-night phone calls, the mysterious business meetings, and the way her new husband's eyes would linger on her financial statements rather than on her. Then came the day she discovered his phone, carelessly left unlocked on their bedroom dresser. What she found would shatter their carefully constructed facade: messages, photos, and something even more damaging, a detailed plan that would make any gold digger proud. The thing about wealth is that it doesn't just buy luxury, it buys loyalty. And Mrs. Richardson had people in her corner who'd been with her long before her young husband appeared on the scene. These same people had been gathering evidence, watching, waiting, and building a case that would turn the tables on her beloved spouse's carefully laid plans. Now, as I sit here watching security footage from that fateful afternoon, I can't help but wonder, did he really think he could outsmart a woman who'd spent 4 decades outmaneuvering some of the shrewdest business minds in the country? Did he truly believe she'd let him walk away with half her fortune without a fight? But here's where things get interesting. What he didn't know about Mrs. Richardson's past would come back to haunt him in ways he never could have imagined. As the pieces of her counterplan fell into place, it became clear that this wasn't just about money anymore. This was about justice, revenge, and teaching a valuable lesson to those who prey on the wealthy and vulnerable. What happened next would send shockwaves through their social circle and leave everyone questioning who was really playing who in this high-stakes game of love and deception. The truth, as they say, is stranger than fiction, and in this case, it would prove to be more explosive than anyone could have anticipated. Let me take you back 3 years to when this story really began. Mrs. Richardson had just lost her husband of 30 years to cancer, leaving her alone in their sprawling estate. The loneliness that followed was crushing, though she'd never admit it to anyone. She threw herself into her work, expanding her real estate empire to cope with the emptiness. That's when he entered the picture. Michael was a rising star in the local art scene, charming gallery owners with his paintings and smooth talk. Their paths crossed at the annual Children's Hospital fundraiser, where one of his pieces was being auctioned. He approached her with such genuine warmth that even her usually skeptical nature softened. Their courtship was a whirlwind of private jet trips to Paris, moonlit yacht parties, and intimate dinners at exclusive restaurants. To the outside world, it seemed like a May-December romance for the ages. Her friends noticed how she smiled more, walked taller, seemed years younger in his presence. Even her longtime butler, James, who distrusted most newcomers, appeared to warm up to Michael's presence in the house. But there were whispers, the kind that float through country club lounges and charity galas. Some noticed how Michael's art career mysteriously stalled after the wedding. Others raised eyebrows at his frequent visits to the family lawyer's office, asking detailed questions about Mrs. Richardson's estate planning. The red flags were there, waving in plain sight. What people didn't know was that Mrs. Richardson had been quietly documenting everything. Every suspicious phone call, every unexplained absence, every subtle attempt to access her business accounts. Her personal assistant, Sarah, had been keeping a detailed log of Michael's activities, including his frequent meetings with a mysterious woman at a downtown coffee shop. The breaking point came during their anniversary dinner at home. As Mrs. Richardson pretended to sip her wine, she watched Michael check his phone for the 1,000th time that evening. A text message preview flashed across his screen. "Everything's ready for next week, once the papers are signed." He quickly locked the phone, but the damage was done. That night, as Michael slept soundly beside her, Mrs. Richardson made a call to her old friend at the FBI's white-collar crime division. What they uncovered in their investigation would make even the most hardened detective's jaw drop. Michael wasn't just planning to take her money. He was part of a sophisticated ring targeting wealthy widows across 3 states. But Mrs. Richardson had a few tricks up her designer sleeve. You see, before her late husband passed away, he had shared with her a valuable lesson from his years in corporate takeovers. Sometimes you have to let your opponent think they're winning before you show your hand. And Mrs. Richardson was about to play her cards in a way that would leave everyone at the table stunned. The day of reckoning arrived on a sunny Tuesday morning. Mrs. Richardson had arranged for her lawyers to meet with Michael to discuss expanding his role in the company. His eyes lit up at the prospect, exactly as she predicted. As Michael straightened his tie and headed to the downtown office, Mrs. Richardson activated the final phase of her plan. What Michael didn't know was that every major financial publication had a reporter stationed near the building. The FBI had agents positioned in adjacent offices. His mysterious coffee shop companion was already in custody, singing like a canary about their entire operation. But the real surprise awaited him in the conference room. When Michael walked in, expecting to finally gain control of the Richardson fortune, he instead found himself face to face with not just Mrs. Richardson's lawyers, but also 6 of his previous victims, women from Boston, Chicago, and Seattle, all wealthy widows who'd fallen for his charm, all of whom he'd abandoned after failing to access their fortunes. The color drained from his face as he recognized each one. Mrs. Richardson watched through a one-way mirror as Michael's carefully constructed world began to crumble. His phone buzzed incessantly, his partners in crime desperately trying to warn him that their scheme had been exposed. The offshore accounts they'd set up to handle the money were already frozen. Their fake identities, shell companies, and elaborate paper trails had all been unraveled. But the most devastating blow came when Sarah, Mrs. Richardson's trusted assistant, walked into the room. She wasn't just an assistant. She was an undercover FBI agent who'd been building a case against Michael's organization for the past year. Every conversation, every document he'd touched, every secret meeting he'd attended had been carefully documented and would now be used as evidence. Michael's hand trembled as he reached for the water glass in front of him. The trap had been perfectly laid, and he'd walked right into it. But just as the FBI agents approached the conference room door, Mrs. Richardson received an urgent message that would change everything. Something about Michael's past had come to light, something so shocking that it would turn this simple case of fraud into something far more sinister. The urgent message on Mrs. Richardson's phone was from her late husband's former business partner. Michael wasn't just any fraudster. He was the son of the man who'd nearly destroyed her husband's company 20 years ago. The same scandal that had led to her husband's depression and, ultimately, may have contributed to his early death. This wasn't just about money. It was personal revenge, carefully plotted across generations. In that moment, Mrs. Richardson's composed facade cracked slightly. The conference room's tension thickened as she entered, her heels clicking deliberately against the marble floor. But before she could confront Michael with this revelation, another bombshell dropped. Sarah, the undercover FBI agent, received an alert. Someone had just initiated a massive transfer from Mrs. Richardson's primary business accounts, bypassing all security protocols. Michael's smirk returned. Despite being cornered, he still held one last card. "Did you really think I worked alone?" he asked, his voice steady. "While you were all here putting on this little show, my people have been busy elsewhere." The other victims gasped as their phones began pinging with similar alerts. Their accounts were being drained too. Mrs. Richardson's tech team scrambled to trace the breach. The source led them to someone inside her own company, someone who'd been there long before Michael, someone she trusted implicitly. Security cameras showed her most senior financial advisor emptying his office on the top floor, preparing for a hasty departure. But what truly sent shockwaves through the room was the document that fell from Michael's jacket as he stood up. A yellowed photograph showing a much younger Mrs. Richardson with Michael's father, dated long before she met her late husband. The story suddenly became much deeper, much more twisted than anyone had imagined, and the truth that was about to emerge would shake the foundations of everything Mrs. Richardson had built. Mrs. Richardson held up the old photograph, her hands steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. "I was wondering when this would surface," she said, her voice carrying an unexpected note of triumph. "Your father didn't just try to destroy my husband's company, Michael. He destroyed his own life trying to prove I was behind his downfall." In that moment, everything clicked into place. The compromised accounts, a deliberate trap, filled with traceable cryptocurrency that was already being seized globally, the fleeing financial advisor, an FBI plant working with Sarah, closing the net on the entire criminal network. Mrs. Richardson hadn't just anticipated their plan. She had orchestrated every detail of their downfall. "Your father never knew one crucial detail," Mrs. Richardson continued, pulling out another photograph. "His own father was the one who embezzled the money, not mine. I tried to warn him, but his hatred for my family blinded him. Just like your hatred blinded you." Michael sank into his chair as decades of family lies unraveled before him. But the final twist came from an unexpected source. As the FBI moved in to make the arrest, Sarah received one last message. Michael's mysterious coffee shop companion wasn't just any accomplice. She was Mrs. Richardson's own granddaughter, planted deep undercover years ago. They had orchestrated this elaborate sting not just to catch a criminal, but to finally clear a family name that had been tarnished for generations. As Michael was led away in handcuffs, Mrs. Richardson watched with a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The truth about both families would now become public, changing countless lives forever. As she turned to leave, she glanced at her phone one last time. A message from her late husband's email account, scheduled years ago. "My darling, if you're reading this, you finally finished what we started. I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see it." The Richardson estate would never be the same, but perhaps now, after 3 generations of secrets and lies, healing could finally begin. In the weeks following Michael's arrest, the Richardson estate transformed from a symbol of wealth to a beacon of healing. Mrs. Richardson converted part of her mansion into a support center for victims of financial fraud, where the other women who'd been targeted now volunteered their time and expertise. Their stories of survival and resilience touched countless lives. The investigation revealed just how extensive Michael's network had been. Dozens of wealthy individuals across the country had been targeted, but thanks to Mrs. Richardson's careful planning, most of their assets were recovered. Her granddaughter, the undercover operative at the coffee shop, emerged as a rising star in the FBI's white-collar crime division, carrying on her family's legacy of protecting others. Sarah stayed on as Mrs. Richardson's actual assistant, their bond strengthened by the months they'd spent working together to bring down the criminal enterprise. The truth about both families became a cautionary tale in business schools, teaching future generations about the devastating costs of revenge and the importance of seeking truth over assumptions. Mrs. Richardson found herself spending more time in her late husband's study, reading through old correspondence and finally understanding the full weight he had carried. She discovered letters he'd written to Michael's father, attempting to reveal the truth about the embezzlement, all returned unopened. The cycle of hatred could have continued for another generation, but she had chosen to break it. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn morning, Mrs. Richardson received an unexpected letter from Michael, written from prison. It contained a simple but profound apology, not just for his crimes, but for allowing his father's bitterness to poison his own heart. She responded with an invitation to talk, not about the past, but about healing the wounds that both families had carried for too long. The Richardson estate still stands today, its gates now open to those seeking help and hope. The crystal chandeliers still cast their shadows on marble floors, but they illuminate something far more valuable than wealth. They shine light on the power of truth, the strength of forgiveness, and the importance of breaking cycles of vengeance. As for Mrs. Richardson, she often sits in her garden, watching young couples walk hand in hand past her gates and smiles, not because she caught a gold digger, but because she helped break a chain of hatred that had bound two families for generations. Sometimes, the greatest wealth isn't in our bank accounts, but in our capacity to end the cycles that threaten to destroy us. And that old photograph, it sits framed on her desk, no longer a symbol of betrayal, but a reminder that the truth, no matter how long buried, eventually finds its way to the light.